Hi there, my name is Bonnie Stabile, and I'm the founder of the Gender and Policy Center here at the Schar School of Policy and Government. And I'm really happy to talk to you today about my recent book. It's called Women, Power, and Rape Culture, The Politics and Policy of Underrepresentation. I started my acknowledgments in the book by saying I really didn't want to have a book with the term rape culture in the title because it's a little bit in your face and can be kind of jarring to some. But I think that as we talk about the book a little bit, we'll understand, hopefully I'll be able to explain in part why I went with that title and what the book is trying to accomplish. So in 2017, when our school at George Mason School of Policy and Government received a naming gift, we were asked to think about what initiatives we wanted to see brought forth and where we thought research was needed in important areas of policy as part of the new naming of the school and the re-envisioning of where it was going. And I, at that time, started the Gender and Policy Center here. At that time, one of the things I was studying was campus sexual assault and the implications for young women's lives. And subsequently, we went through the Me Too movement, which was just beginning right about the time, coincidentally, that the center started. And a primary point of interest to me in my recent work has been, for quite some time, has been women's representation. So we know that women are underrepresented in positions of power in the public sphere. But I also see, as somebody with a PhD in public policy, which is sort of a practical application of political science in my view, we know that policy outcomes are often worse for women in many areas. So with regard to access to education, finances, job stability, proneness to violence, many areas, women fare less well. And generally speaking, as a social scientist, we think that what should happen is that gender and race and other identities that we often get asked about on surveys should be used as control variables, meaning that we don't see differential outcomes for those groups based on identities, particularly in a democracy where, what it says in our Constitution is that really there should be liberty and justice for all, that everybody should be equally represented and everyone's interests should be fairly treated, and that people have the ability to live their lives as they would like. In any event, since I know those things aren't always true, and since public policy is about solving public problems, we're trying to see what can we do to see if women could be better represented in society. Now, of course, we know that things have changed dramatically for the better over time, but we're still not anywhere near parity. So we know that about a third of women in the US Congress are, a third of US Congress members are women. We know that about 5% of corporate CEOs are women. So there are disparities despite advances. In any event, one of the points of this book, or the overarching thesis, is really just that proneness to violence, the extent to which women have to live with the burden of the threat of sexual violence, whether that's verbal, harassment, assault, or rape, constitutes a very significant percentage of women in society who are affected. So in the United States alone, between 1/4 and 1/5 of all young women on college campuses experience some kind of sexual violence, and women in society is also quite a large number of 20% or so or more. And of course, the numbers for sexual harassment are very substantially higher, with the majority of women experiencing some form of sexual harassment in the educational or professional environment. So my thesis of the book is really just that that problem in and of itself as a class, which in many ways constitutes rape culture per se, constitute a structural impediment to women's ability to advance in the public sphere. That is to say that a primary reason that women are underrepresented is because of the burden they face in these capacities. And so what I've done is, again, because I do public policy, is think about where is the codification in law or policy that either advances, promotes women's rights and abilities, or fails to adequately protect them. And so the book looks at the different branches of government, the executive, congressional, and executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government. And also there's a chapter on the campus context. And the reason for that is that I consider the campus environment the place where, importantly, many personal and professional preliminary relationships, if you will, are formed. And when there's disruption there due to sexual violence or harassment, that creates an impediment to women's leadership capacity. I discovered, as articulated by Laura Dunn, who's one of my interview subjects, who's a lawyer who works on campus sexual assault defense. And what she noted was that under the Trump administration, the definition of sexual harassment in the school setting under Title IX was actually, and I'll quote her, less expansive than the workplace standard for sexual harassment under Title IX and related anti-discrimination laws in the workplace. So in other words, what she said was that adults in the workplace, what they were found not to have been able to tolerate, somehow kids in school were expected to deal with, that they were less protected by Title IX than workplace employees were by Title VII. And when you consider that we have to protect children, it seems like that should be really inherent to what any law does, that is pretty dramatic. And so reading these egregious cases that led to these Supreme Court cases, and then seeing what often was a very inadequate or limp response, is very troubling. And certainly in the other branches of government, the book really looks at, in the executive branch, in this particular case, the book came out in fall of 2022, and it looks back at the pivotal point of Donald Trump's election and the Women's March that happened the day after his inauguration, and the anger that women felt from not being believed, from listening to the rhetoric that really was the so-called locker room talk, right, that disparaged women and that got this advancement from the highest office in the land, right? For the most powerful person in the country was speaking disparagingly, not just of women, but in the case that I'm studying, women, talked about them in such a way that I think set back their interests to a certain extent, but also to the extent that he spoke so openly and disparagingly that it brought forth a surge of women wanting to talk about these experiences and wanting to deal with them, wanting to run for office. We saw an unprecedented number of women running for office after 2017. So it really is a pivotal moment that I thought was worth exploring. And in the chapter on which is called The Commander-in-Chief and the Bully Pulpit, I talk about the presidential rhetoric in categories of how women are characterized and in ways that make them seem less trustworthy or less competent. And I created a mnemonic device that's called SILENT, and the categories include things like stamina, intelligence, looks, emotional state, etc., ending with the T in silent for trustworthiness. So to bring to people's attention how we often speak of women, and that particularly when it came from the presidential level, how that could have a problematic element in public life. And the other chapters in the campus context, I talk about the Congressional Accountability Act, the Congressional Accountability Reform Act, and what it did or didn't do to advance women's interest where Congress is concerned. Specifically that, people in Congress haven't been held to account in the same way that other members of the public are for their behavior. So looking at specifically what policy elements were there and what was done and what the shortcomings or advancements there might be. In the chapter on the judiciary, it's called A Tale of Two Justices, Who's Holding Court. And there I analyze the decisions of Clarence Thomas and look at the judicial decisions of Brett Kavanaugh because they were both plausibly accused of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and the process by which that testimony was heard was curtailed and abbreviated due to power structures that disabled women from speaking as openly or as fully as they might have been able to in a more fair process. So I thought it was worth looking at sort of the whole arc of the implications of that by looking at those decisions. This idea that we have this belief that if the system is fair, that the system is fair and that has been developed by wise elders and wise minds, and that, you know, the rules are fair. And but we saw in the case of Anita Hill, when she stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was at the time chaired by Joe Biden when he was a senator, he exclaimed at the end, you know, well, this was a fair process. I followed all the rules. And what he didn't really say was that he made the rules. Like, he got to decide whether and when and how many witnesses would be heard. And in fact, that process resulted in a very curtailed amount of time, a very rushed process that omitted voices of women who wanted to testify. And so the idea that rules are fair doesn't really play out in this realm, unfortunately. And again, therefore, one would hope that if more women were represented in these decision-making places in the Senate, on the Judiciary Committee, on the Supreme Court, that we would have, and other lesser courts, though we see advancements there, the dominant voice is still not that of women. And we see that the decades and centuries of rulemaking, as they've been interpreted in the law, really do put women at a disadvantage as far as being heard in the public sphere. So I think those protective elements of law and the structure of law and how it requires our attention to change and evolve over time in order to bring us closer to justice and fairness is something that really warrants our attention. And what we find in all of these areas is that policy instruments are often imperfect, that they might provide, in some sense, the bottom line is they might represent an advancement, such as in the case of some Supreme Court cases, but they may also, with what they give with one hand, may take away in the other, meaning that there may be a policy advancement, but it may be so difficult to access. For instance, the ability of women working for members of Congress to report instances of sexual harassment or assault, but the process itself that's prescribed is so labyrinthian that one might even just say, like, forget it, I just give up. You know, it's I have this right, but it's so hard to access or enact that it doesn't really constitute an actual right. So those are the chapters of the book. That's a very sort of quick description of everything, but just to give you an idea of, in any case where there's a policy problem, and in this case, I would say underrepresentation of women and disparate outcomes in public services or public outcomes regarding health or educational access and the like. So if we begin to diagnose those policy problems, we see that one part of the diagnosis is that the combined effect of the burden experienced by women with regard to sexual harassment and violence in general can constitute an impediment to their advancement in positions of power in the public sphere. And one thing about more equitable representation is that it would allow for, one would hope, better voicing of women's position, more, you know, more testimonial justice, if you will, for women, which could result in better outcomes for everyone across society. Because what we do observe in the research more broadly is that when there's better, more just and equitable representation of women and other underrepresented groups, that outcomes are really better for everyone in society, better for the bottom line, better from the perspective of justice and fairness. So that's the contribution I hope to make with the book, to just advance some insights there that could help with these matters of justice and equity. So again, my name is Bonnie Stabile, and the book is called Women, Power, and Rape Culture: The Politics and Policy of Representation. And thank you so much for listening.